Then also, remember I talked about the release planning. So here I'll say that a release planning presents a roadmap of how the team intends to achieve the product vision within the project objectives and constraints identified upfront. So it helps the product owner and the whole team decide how much must be developed and how long that will take before they have releasable products. If you understand the import or the meaning of this particular statement, so usually within the Scrum project is broken down into what we refer to as sprints. And if you notice the statement here, it says it helps the product owner and the whole team decide how much must be developed. So if we have a set of product backlog items, then we now need to determine how much of these product backlog items must be developed before we can eventually release the product. So that's why I explained earlier that our release plan might be maybe at the end of the second or third or even fourth iteration, depending on how long it takes us to be able to actualize all of those items you have within the product backlog that will enable us to release the product. A release conveys expectations about what is likely to be developed and in what time frame. A release plan serves as a guidepost towards which the project team can progress. So the release plan essentially helps the project team to determine the best way to be able to accomplish its release. So if you want to carry out your releases, there are specific steps that you need to follow in order to implement your release. These are some of the steps that you need to follow. First, you need to determine conditions of satisfaction. Say, for example, what are the features that we need to have within the product in order for us to be able to make it releasable? Then estimate the user stories. So user stories are now the items that you have within the product backlog. Those are what we refer to as the user story. Then, of course, you can do this in any sequence. It doesn't necessarily follow any particular order. So you can select a sprint duration, determine how long the sprint will take, then estimate velocity, and then prioritize user stories. And then you estimate your user stories. So usually, every user story that you have within the product backlog has to have what we refer to as story point. So story point is like a weighting system. We're going to talk about that much more later. It's like a weighting system, which of course we use in order to distinguish the user stories based on certain factors. For example, complexity, risk involved, or ease of implementation. And then, of course, it can also be based on expected benefits. So each user story is typically assigned what we refer to as a story point. So let's say you have user stories A, and then user story B, then user story C, then user story D, then user story E, then maybe user story F, then maybe user story G. Of course, don't forget, all of these user stories are features that we need to deploy within the solution or the product itself. So each of these user stories now assigned a point, and that's what we refer to as the story point. Say, for example, A might be given a point of 5, then B might be given a point of 10, then C might be given a point of 7, and D might be given a point of 5. And that's what we refer to as story point. So at this point, this is what you do during the estimate user stories. That's when you determine the story points for your user stories. So once you've determined your story point for your user stories, you now estimate the team's velocity. So the team's velocity basically talks about how many story points are the team able to implement within a particular sprint. And that, of course, is what we refer to as the velocity of the team. For example, if the team's velocity is 15, it means that in a particular sprint, they cannot do more than 15 total story points. So if this team, for example, wants to implement this project, they might do user story A, which is 5, user story B, which is 10, and that's the 15 in this case. So they will not go beyond this. So that's essentially what we refer to as the velocity. So you determine the velocity of the team. In essence, you determine how much work the team can implement within a sprint. That's what we refer to as the velocity. So you estimate the duration of the sprint. So you can choose a 2-week sprint, a 3-week sprint, or even a 4-week sprint. And then you now prioritize user stories. So user story prioritization is majorly done by the product owner, who of course determines the value of these user stories and how best they will be able to add value within the project itself. So once you've been able to do that, you now select user stories and then also a release date. So you select user stories that has to be implemented in order to enable us go live. That's essentially what this means. And then also the date that we're going to go live. That's what we refer to as the release date. So once you do finish this, you also go back and begin to iterate again. In other words, planning for your next release as the case may be. So iterate until the release conditions of satisfaction can best be met. So this is a typical example of how the release planning works. And so you can see this represents our product backlog. These are items that you have within the product backlog. So all of these together is our product backlog. So let's say, for example, we have different user stories. So this is different user stories that you have within the product backlog. So we hold a release planning meeting where we determine essentially how many of these user stories has to be accomplished before we choose to release the product. So in the course of after the release planning meeting, then we can create our release plan. So our release plan essentially will now capture the items that needs to be accomplished within each sprint, and then how many sprints in total are we going to run before eventually we release the product. So in this case, it has been determined that we're going to release the product maybe at the end of iteration 7. So the purpose of the release plan is to define the content of a release or a specific shippable product or increment. So in essence, we basically do our release planning to determine when we're going to go live or when we're going to release specific products.